Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? You're probably aware of that saying, but do you know where that came from or how old that saying is? In about AD 200, Sextus Empiricus wrote a work on the tendency to skepticism that went back to about 200 BC up to his day, and categorized all of the issues having to do with the tendency to skepticism. This is a good example of how a good knowledge of New Testament backgrounds will help you in your sermon preparation. If you look at what Sextus Empiricus wrote as a primary source regarding smoke and fire, that's pretty interesting how it ties into the New Testament. So just to read a short passage, thus the commemorative sign, when observed in conjunction with the thing signified in a clear perception, brings us, as soon as it is presented, and when the thing signified has become non-evident, to a recollection of the thing observed along with it, and now no longer clearly perceived, as is the case of smoke and fire. For, as we have often observed these to be connected with each other, as soon as we see the one, that is to say, smoke, we recall the other, that is to say, the unseen fire. The same account applies to the scar which follows on the wound, and to the puncture of the heart which precedes death. For on seeing the scar, we recall the wound which preceded it, and on viewing the puncture of the heart, we foretell the imminence of death. Such then is the special character of the commemorative sign. So what Sextus Empiricus is saying is that as a skeptic goes to lengths to avoid accepting anything as dogmatic truth, there are still things in their lives that they believe based on certain kinds of signs. So he says even a skeptic would believe that if he sees smoke coming over the top of that hill, that there will be a fire connected to that. He goes on to say other types of the same sign are, if we see that a heart has been punctured, we know that death will follow. And if we see that we have a scar on a hand and look at that scar, we know that a wound preceded that. So what Sextus is doing here, he is taking stock in the kinds of things that a skeptical person would need to be able to see to believe. And why does that affect us in the New Testament? Beginning at John chapter 19, we read, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." And then we read again in chapter 20, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will not believe.'" So what we have here is knowledge then that Thomas was a thoroughgoing skeptic, and there were specific signs that he needed to see as a skeptic to believe that Jesus died and was resurrected from the dead. So we see this, and we understand then now that understanding literature that comes from the era that the New Testament developed helps us to reach our congregations in our preaching. So in this particular case, we can go back and look a little more into, what are the issues surrounding skepticism? Or how might I reach a skeptic today in light of this kind of a connection for this? Reading broadly into New Testament backgrounds is important for depth and breadth in your preaching. And as I've just read, what I would call a primary source is something that was literally written in the New Testament era. There are also works that we should be reading as preachers that are what I would call secondary sources. So for instance, a good start on a primary source, really I would call this, is C.K. Barrett put together a work on primary sources going through Jewish, Roman, Greek philosophers in compiling text from their primary sources that were most pertinent to the New Testament. So to get a good start, you can get much of that in a work like this, C.K. Barrett, the New Testament background. Secondarily, I think that a preacher should always be honing up his skills and understanding of New Testament backgrounds by reading broadly. This is an example of a Backgrounds of Early Christianity book written by Everett Ferguson. And this is going to give the preacher a good knowledge of backgrounds regarding politics, cultural practices, society at the time, economics, religions that interacted with Christianity, philosophies, all these kinds of things that were in society and that pervaded the world of the New Testament in which it arose, are connections to issues that we find in the text. So for a preacher to be familiar with these things and continuing to grow their familiarity with these things is important. Really, there's no other way to approach this but to read, and read some more. I recommend that every preacher apply themselves to the study of background material to understand the New Testament world in depth, because there are many issues that you can clarify through an understanding of the historical times. So as a resource, I believe that it's important that a preacher continues to expand his knowledge into New Testament background issues. I'll share a link to a couple of good books to begin with in the description below. I invite you to like and subscribe.